Everyone laughed when Waitress defended the Vampire King's disabled daughter, until he stood up. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The laughter started softly at first, like the quiet ripple of a joke that people were not quite sure they should share in public. Then it grew louder, spreading across the elegant dining hall of Nocturn Hall, a restaurant known across Manhattan for its velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and guests who carried the quiet confidence of people who believed the world belonged to them. Silverware clinked against porcelain plates. Expensive wine swirled inside tall glasses. A string quartet played a slow melody near the marble staircase. In the middle of all that wealth and soft golden light stood Emily Carter, a waitress who was trying very hard not to tremble. Emily had worked at Nocturn Hall for nearly a year. She knew how to move quietly between tables. She knew how to smile even when her feet ached after a long shift. She knew how to avoid the sharp words of customers who believed a waitress was invisible. But tonight something different had happened. Tonight Emily had stepped between a group of wealthy diners and a small girl who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The girl looked no older than 8 years old. Her dark hair fell over a pale blue dress that seemed slightly too formal for someone her age. Beside her chair rested a pair of lightweight walking crutches designed for a child. One of her legs was supported by a medical brace that gleamed softly beneath the chandelier light. She had been sitting quietly with a glass of water, trying to reach a dessert menu that had slid too far across the table. That was when the laughter started. A man in a tailored suit had leaned back in his chair and whispered something cruel to the people at his table. The others began to laugh. Another voice joined. Someone else muttered a joke about broken legs and expensive restaurants. The child lowered her eyes. She tried to pull the menu closer again. Her hands were shaking. Emily saw the moment the girl stopped trying. She saw the small shoulders slump as if the child wished she could disappear beneath the tablecloth. Something in Emily's chest tightened painfully. She placed her serving tray down on the nearest table with a quiet but firm sound. Conversations nearby began to slow. Emily walked across the polished floor until she stood beside the little girl. Then she turned to face the laughing diners. Her voice was calm but steady. She told them that the child had done nothing to deserve their cruelty. For a brief second the room fell silent. Then the laughter returned, louder than before. Several guests shook their heads as if the situation was amusing rather than shameful. One man even clapped slowly in mock applause. Emily felt heat rise in her face, but she did not move away. She remained beside the child like a shield. What none of them realized was that someone else had been watching the entire scene from the farthest corner of the restaurant. A tall man dressed in a black suit sat alone at a shadowed table near the back wall. He had not touched the glass of deep red wine in front of him. His expression was calm and unreadable, yet his eyes never left the small girl in the blue dress. And when the laughter reached its loudest point, the man slowly placed his hands on the arms of his chair. Because the child being mocked by the entire room was not just any little girl. She was Lily Draven, and the silent man in the corner was her father. The laughter continued to echo across the dining hall, but Emily Carter did not move away from the small girl beside her. She could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant watching her now. Some faces showed irritation. Others showed amusement. A few looked uncomfortable, as if they knew the moment had crossed a line that polite society preferred to ignore. Emily kept her voice steady as she turned slightly toward the child. The girl still held the edge of the menu with small trembling fingers. Her pale blue dress was neatly pressed, yet it looked strangely formal compared to the relaxed elegance of the restaurant around her. The silver brace supporting her leg reflected the soft chandelier light. Emily lowered her voice so only the girl could hear. She asked gently if the child was all right. The girl nodded very slowly, although the sadness in her eyes suggested that she was used to moments like this. Emily felt something tighten in her chest again. She had seen that expression before. She had seen it in people who had been made to feel small simply for existing. Across the room, a waiter paused with a tray of wine glasses. The manager near the bar frowned as he noticed the attention gathering around Emily and the girl. Nocturn Hall was famous for flawless service and calm elegance. Public conflict did not belong here. Emily knew that very well. She had learned it during her first week when the manager explained the rules of survival inside a restaurant that catered to powerful guests. Smile even when someone speaks down to you. Apologize even when the mistake is not yours. Never challenge the customer. Those rules had helped Emily keep this job for nearly a year. And she needed this job more than anyone in that room would ever understand. Her small apartment on the edge of Queens cost nearly everything she earned. Rent was due at the beginning of every month without mercy. Groceries were counted carefully down to the last dollar. On many nights, Emily returned home so tired that she barely remembered the subway ride across the East River. Yet she always came back the next evening. Because Nocturn Hall paid better than most restaurants in the city. Because losing this job would mean starting over again in a place where tips were smaller and hours were longer. The manager had told her once that guests at Nocturn Hall expected perfection. Emily had believed him. She had learned every table number by heart. She had memorized the wine list and practiced carrying 3 plates in each hand without shaking. She had even learned how to recognize the quiet signals of wealthy customers who wanted attention without asking for it. But nothing in that training had prepared her for the moment when cruelty appeared right in front of her. The man who had started the laughter leaned forward again in his chair. His expensive watch flashed beneath the chandelier light as he lifted his glass of wine. His voice carried easily across the nearby tables. He made another remark about how children who could not walk properly probably did not belong in a restaurant like this one. Several people at his table laughed again. Emily felt the anger rise in her chest like a sudden flame. Yet beside her the girl remained silent. The child did not argue. She did not cry. She simply lowered her eyes again, as if she had learned that speaking up would only make things worse. Emily placed one hand gently on the back of the empty chair beside the girl. Her voice remained calm, but firm as she spoke again. She said that everyone deserved to sit and eat in peace without being mocked. She reminded the man that kindness did not cost anything. A few guests nearby shifted uncomfortably. One older woman at a nearby table looked down at her plate with a troubled expression. But the group of laughing diners did not stop. The man only smirked and leaned back in his chair as if the entire situation amused him. What none of them understood was that the child sitting quietly beside Emily was not alone in this room. And the silent man in the shadowed corner had just heard every single word. The man in the shadowed corner did not move, yet the atmosphere around his table felt strangely heavier, as if the air itself had grown colder. His name was Alexander Draven. Most people in the room would have recognized the name instantly if it had been spoken aloud. Financial empires whispered about him. Old families in New York spoke about him with quiet respect. Yet tonight no one had introduced him. He had arrived alone and chosen the darkest table in the restaurant, the one that faced the entire dining hall, while remaining almost invisible to casual attention. Alexander sat perfectly still, his posture straight and calm. A glass of deep red wine rested untouched in front of him. The candlelight reflected faintly against the surface of the liquid, but his attention was nowhere near the glass. His eyes remained fixed on the small girl seated across the room, Lily Draven, his daughter. To the rest of the restaurant, she looked like a quiet child with a leg brace and a pair of crutches beside her chair. But to Alexander, she was the only person in the world who could still make his centuries-old heart feel something dangerously close to fear. Lily had insisted earlier that evening that she wanted to see the city. She wanted to sit in a real restaurant like other children. She had said she was tired of private dining rooms and silent halls inside their enormous home on the northern edge of Manhattan. Alexander had listened to her with that calm expression he always wore. Then he had agreed. But he had not told her the full truth. He had not told her that he would remain nearby, watching, protecting. That was why he had chosen the table in the shadows tonight. From there he could see every entrance, every waiter, every movement inside the room. Centuries of experience had taught him to watch the world carefully. Human cruelty was not new to him. He had seen it across generations and across continents. But hearing it directed toward his daughter was something entirely different. Alexander slowly lifted his eyes toward the table where the laughing diners sat. His expression did not change. His breathing did not change. Yet something subtle shifted in the air around him. A man at the next table suddenly rubbed his arms as if the temperature had dropped. A nearby waiter paused briefly, confused by a sudden chill that did not seem to come from the air conditioning vents. Alexander Draven had ruled the hidden world of vampires for more than 600 years. Power flowed through him as naturally as breath flowed through ordinary men. He rarely allowed that power to surface in public. Humans were fragile creatures. They frightened easily. But the sound of laughter directed toward Lily echoed across the marble floor like an insult that could not be ignored. His gaze moved toward Emily Carter. The waitress still stood beside Lily with quiet determination. She had placed herself between the child and the cruel voices of the diners. Alexander studied her carefully now. She looked young, perhaps in her middle 20s. Her uniform was simple black and white like the other waiters in the restaurant. Yet there was something unusual about her posture. Most humans would have stepped away by now. Most would have apologized and returned to their duties the moment the wealthy guests began to mock them. But Emily Carter had not moved. She remained beside Lily like a guard standing watch. Alexander felt something unexpected stir. In his thoughts, curiosity. Humans often disappointed him. Yet every so often one of them revealed a courage that refused to bend in the face of cruelty. Emily Carter appeared to be one of those rare exceptions. Across the room the laughing man lifted his wine glass again and prepared to speak another cruel remark. At that moment Alexander Draven slowly rose from his chair. Alexander Draven rose from his chair with the quiet grace of a man who had spent centuries mastering control. The movement itself was simple, yet something about it caused the subtle rhythm of the restaurant to falter. A waiter carrying a tray slowed his steps without understanding why. The string quartet near the staircase hesitated for a brief moment before continuing their melody. The elegant dining room of Nocturn Hall was designed to feel warm and welcoming, but as Alexander stood the temperature seemed to shift almost imperceptibly, like the first breath of winter slipping through an open door. Across the room, Emily Carter did not notice him at first. Her attention remained focused on Lily. The child still sat quietly at the table, her small hands folded near the untouched dessert menu. Her crutches rested against the side of the chair, and the silver brace supporting her leg caught the glow of the chandelier above. Emily bent slightly, so that her voice would remain gentle and calm when she spoke to the girl. She told Lily that she did not need to listen to the cruel voices around her. She told her that sometimes people laughed when they did not understand how to be kind. Lily glanced up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. The sadness in the child's expression softened slightly as she listened. She gave a small nod that looked both grateful and shy. For a moment, Emily almost forgot about the crowd behind her. Then the loud voice returned. The man at the nearby table leaned forward again with a mocking smile. His companions were clearly enjoying the attention their laughter had created. He spoke loudly enough for half the dining room to hear him. He said that perhaps the waitress should find a more suitable place for the child to sit. He suggested that restaurants like Nocturn Hall were meant for people who could walk properly through the door without assistance. The comment was followed by another wave of laughter. A few guests nearby lowered their eyes in embarrassment, but no one spoke. Emily felt the heat of anger rise again in her chest. Yet she kept her voice controlled. She told the man that the child had every right to sit in the restaurant like anyone else. She reminded him that respect was something people should give freely, not something that depended on perfect legs or perfect health. The man rolled his eyes and lifted his wine glass as if the entire exchange amused him. He said that the waitress was becoming dramatic over something that was clearly a joke. Emily opened her mouth to respond again when Lily gently touched her sleeve. The small gesture was hesitant but sincere. Lily whispered that it was all right and that Emily did not need to argue anymore. The child voice carried a quiet maturity that surprised Emily. It was the voice of someone who had already experienced more cruelty than a child should ever have to face. Emily looked down at her and shook her head softly. She said that no one deserved to feel unwelcome simply for being different. Around them the room had grown noticeably quieter. More guests had turned to watch the unfolding moment. Some appeared curious while others looked increasingly uncomfortable. At the far end of the dining hall, Alexander Draven began walking slowly across the polished marble floor. Each step was calm and deliberate. His black suit moved smoothly with his stride, and the low golden light of the chandeliers reflected briefly against his dark hair. A waiter stepped aside instinctively as Alexander passed. Something in the man's presence made people move without understanding why. He did not raise his voice. He did not hurry. Yet every person who glanced in his direction felt a strange weight settle in the air around them. The laughing man at the table finally noticed the approaching figure and frowned slightly as Alexander came closer. Emily was still facing Lily and had not yet turned to see who was walking toward them. But within seconds the entire room would understand that the quiet man who had risen from the shadows was not simply another guest inside Nocturne Hall. Alexander Draven continued walking across the polished marble floor of Nocturne Hall, and with every step the quiet tension inside the room grew stronger. It was not the kind of tension that came from loud arguments or sudden movements. It was something deeper, something instinctive that made people pause without understanding why. A couple seated near the center of the dining hall stopped their conversation mid-sentence. A waiter holding a silver tray slowed his pace and glanced around, as if searching for the source of the strange feeling that had passed through the room like a cold breeze. The chandeliers above still glowed warmly, and the musicians near the staircase continued to play their soft melody, yet the air itself seemed different. Colder. Heavier. At the table where the cruel laughter had started, the man with the expensive watch was still leaning back in his chair. He had not yet realized that the tall figure approaching from the shadows was walking directly toward him. Instead, he lifted his glass again and prepared to make another mocking remark. His voice carried across the nearby tables as he continued to laugh about the child and the waitress who had dared to defend her. Emily Carter was still standing beside Lily. She had noticed that the restaurant had grown quieter, but she assumed it was simply because the argument had drawn attention. Her focus remained on the little girl. Emily gently slid the dessert menu closer so Lily would not need to reach so far. She spoke softly and asked what kind of dessert she liked the most. The child hesitated for a moment before whispering that she liked strawberry cake. Her voice was quiet but hopeful, as if she did not often get the chance to choose such things. Emily smiled warmly and told her that strawberry cake was one of the best choices on the menu. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt important. Lily's shoulders relaxed slightly, and the fear in her eyes faded just a little. Then the loud voice of the mocking man cut through the calm again. He laughed and said that perhaps the waitress planned to babysit the girl for the rest of the evening. His companions joined in with another round of laughter. One of them even tapped the table and joked that the child should practice walking better before visiting restaurants meant for successful people. A few diners nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware that the remarks had crossed from rude into openly cruel. Yet no one spoke. No one except the waitress who had already chosen her side. Emily straightened slowly and turned to face the group again. She told them that kindness should not be so difficult for grown adults to understand. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying across the quiet room. The man rolled his eyes as if the conversation bored him. He opened his mouth to answer with another insult. That was when he finally noticed the tall figure standing beside his table. Alexander Draven had arrived without a single sound. The black fabric of his suit absorbed the warm light of the chandeliers, and his presence seemed to pull the attention of the entire room toward him. The mocking man frowned slightly as he looked up. At first he seemed annoyed that someone had interrupted his entertainment. But then he met Alexander's eyes. Something in that gaze made the man fall silent before a single word could leave his mouth. Around them the temperature seemed to drop another degree. A waiter standing several feet away rubbed his arms as if a sudden chill had passed through the air. Emily sensed the shift in the room and finally turned her head to see what had changed. For the first time she saw the tall man standing beside the table where the laughter had begun. She had never seen him before, yet something about him immediately commanded attention. His expression was calm, almost perfectly still, but the atmosphere around him carried a quiet authority that made the entire dining hall hold its breath. And beside Emily, the small girl Lily slowly lifted her eyes toward the man who had just stepped out of the shadows. The moment Lily lifted her eyes toward the tall man standing beside the table, something in her expression changed instantly. The fear that had been quietly hiding behind her gaze faded, replaced by a small spark of recognition. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table as she whispered one soft word. "Father." The word was quiet, almost lost beneath the low music of the string quartet, yet several people close enough to hear it suddenly froze. Emily Carter heard it clearly. For a brief second, she thought the child might simply be calling for comfort. But when she looked at the man standing beside the laughing diners, she realized that Lily was not speaking in hope. She was speaking in certainty. The tall man turned his attention toward the girl. His expression softened in a way that seemed almost impossible compared to the cold authority that surrounded him only moments before. He walked the remaining steps toward Lily's table with calm precision. The guests seated around them shifted uneasily as he passed. Some felt the strange chill in the air again. Others felt something far harder to explain. Instinct. The quiet warning that told them the man moving through the room carried a presence that did not belong to ordinary society. Alexander Draven stopped beside Lily's chair. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he reached down and gently rested one hand on the back of the chair beside her, a silent gesture that was both protective and reassuring. Lily looked up at him with the small, relieved smile of a child who knew she was safe. Across the dining hall, several other guests had begun to watch more closely now. Among them were individuals who were not entirely human themselves. Nocturn Hall was known in certain circles as a place where powerful figures from different worlds occasionally crossed paths. A pale woman seated near the far wall stiffened as she recognized the man beside Lily. Her eyes widened slightly before she quickly lowered her gaze. At another table, a sharply dressed man who had been quietly eating his dinner stopped moving his fork. He glanced toward Alexander and then immediately looked down at his plate, as if he had suddenly remembered something extremely important about the food in front of him. They recognized him, not by name spoken aloud, but by presence alone. Those who belonged to the hidden world understood exactly who had just stepped out of the shadows, and the realization moved through them like a silent shock. Emily Carter noticed the strange reactions spreading across the room. She saw the way some diners suddenly avoided looking directly at the man beside Lily. She saw the way a waiter who had been approaching the table quietly changed direction and moved away. Confusion flickered across Emily's face. She had expected the man to be Lily's guardian or perhaps a concerned relative, but the atmosphere surrounding him suggested something far greater than that. At the table where the cruel laughter had started, the mocking man finally found his voice again. His earlier confidence returned as he glanced between the waitress and the silent stranger who had joined them. He leaned back in his chair and gave a dismissive shrug. If the child belonged to you, then perhaps you should keep her away from places where she makes people uncomfortable. The remark hung in the air for a moment. Several diners inhaled sharply. Emily felt anger surge inside her again. But before she could speak, the man beside Lily slowly turned his head toward the speaker. Alexander Draven looked directly at him. The calm expression on his face had not changed, yet the quiet power behind his gaze suddenly felt unmistakable. And all around the room, the few individuals who understood exactly who stood before them realized that the foolish man at the table had just insulted the daughter of the most powerful vampire alive. For several long seconds, the restaurant remained perfectly still. The mocking man stared back at Alexander Draven with the careless confidence of someone who believed wealth and social status protected him from consequences. He had no idea what kind of man he had just insulted. Around the room, a few of the guests who understood the truth were already lowering their eyes. One elderly gentleman slowly placed his napkin on the table, as if preparing to leave before something terrible unfolded. A pale woman seated near the window looked down at her wine glass and quietly whispered a warning under her breath to the person beside her. But the man at the center of the argument did not notice any of this. He only saw a silent stranger and a waitress who refused to step away from a child he had decided was an easy target. Emily Carter felt the tension spreading through the room like a storm that had not yet broken. She did not know exactly who Alexander Draven was, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on every table in the restaurant. The musicians had stopped playing without realizing it. The soft melody had faded away until only the quiet hum of the city outside the tall windows remained. Emily took a slow breath and looked at the man who had started the cruelty. She had already decided she would not stay silent any longer. Her voice came out calm, but sharp as she spoke again. She told him that insulting a child only proved how small a person could be, no matter how expensive their suit was. A few quiet gasps moved through the crowd. The mocking man blinked in surprise, clearly unused to being challenged so directly by someone he considered beneath him. His face flushed with irritation as he pushed his chair back from the table. The sudden scrape of wood against marble echoed across the dining hall. He stood up slowly and pointed toward Lily with a careless gesture. Then he laughed again and said that perhaps the child should not be brought into public if she could not even walk properly without metal attached to her leg. The words were cruel and unnecessary. Lily's shoulders tightened as she heard them. Her small hands gripped the edge of the table again. Emily felt anger surge through her like a spark catching dry wood. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward and struck the man across the face with a sharp sound that carried through the silent restaurant. The impact was not violent enough to injure him, but it was loud enough to freeze every person in the room. The man staggered half a step backward in shock. A red mark appeared on his cheek where Emily's hand had connected. The entire dining hall fell into complete silence. No one spoke. No one even moved. Emily stood there with her hand still raised slightly, breathing harder than before. She had not planned the action. It had simply happened in the instant when anger overcame restraint. Lily looked up at her with wide, astonished eyes. Alexander Draven had not moved at all, yet something in the air around him had changed. The quiet authority that surrounded him now felt colder and far more dangerous. Across the room, one of the guests who understood exactly who he was whispered a single word under his breath. "King." The mocking man finally recovered from his shock. His face twisted with rage as he pointed at Emily and demanded that the manager fire her immediately. He threatened lawsuits and connections and every form of retaliation his wealth could provide. Yet as he shouted, he slowly became aware that no one in the room was looking at him anymore. Every pair of eyes had turned toward the silent man standing beside the child he had insulted. And for the first time, the arrogant guest realized that the true center of power in the room was not himself. The silence after the slap felt heavy enough to press down on every table inside Nocturn Hall. For a long moment, no one moved. The man who had been struck stood frozen beside his chair, one hand slowly rising toward the red mark on his cheek. His expression shifted between shock and disbelief as if his mind refused to accept that a waitress had dared to strike him in public. Emily Carter stood where she was, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her breathing. The sound of her hand meeting his face still echoed faintly in her memory. She knew exactly what it meant. No matter what happened next, she had probably just lost her job. Around the dining hall, several diners exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked impressed. Others looked worried. But none of them dared to speak. The man finally found his voice again. His anger exploded outward like a burst of fire. He shouted that the restaurant would regret allowing an employee to assault a paying guest. He pointed at Emily and demanded that the manager remove her immediately. His voice grew louder with every word as he threatened lawsuits, ruined reputations, and every powerful connection he believed stood behind him. At the far side of the room, the manager of Nocturn Hall rushed forward with hurried steps. His face had gone pale the moment he saw what had happened. The restaurant depended on wealthy customers and peaceful evenings. A public confrontation like this threatened everything he had spent years building. He stepped between the furious man and Emily with both hands raised in a desperate attempt to calm the situation. His voice trembled slightly as he apologized to the guest again and again. Then he turned sharply toward Emily. His expression hardened as he told her that striking a customer was unacceptable no matter what the circumstances had been. Emily listened without interrupting. She already knew what he was going to say next. The manager pointed toward the entrance and told her that her shift was over. He said that security would escort her outside immediately while the restaurant handled the situation with the guest. Two large security guards who had been standing near the door began walking toward them. Their faces were serious but not unkind. They had clearly dealt with difficult situations before, yet even they seemed uneasy tonight, as if the air itself carried something unusual. Lily watched the scene with growing distress. The small girl gripped the edge of her chair and whispered Emily's name softly. She did not understand the rules of restaurants or employment. She only understood that the kind waitress who had defended her was now being punished for it. Emily glanced down at Lily and gave her a reassuring smile. She told the girl quietly that everything would be all right. Then she removed the small black apron tied around her waist and folded it carefully in her hands. The movement felt strangely final. Losing this job would make the coming months difficult. Rent, groceries, subway rides to work that no longer existed. All of those worries passed briefly through her mind. Yet when she looked at Lily, she knew she would make the same choice again. Across the room, the arrogant guest continued to shout about justice and compensation. But fewer people were listening to him now. Their attention had shifted toward the tall, silent figure standing beside Lily's chair. Alexander Draven had not spoken a single word during the entire exchange. Yet the calm stillness of his presence had begun to draw the focus of everyone in the dining hall. The security guard slowed slightly as they approached Emily. Not because of her, but because of the man standing only a few steps away. Something about him made even experienced guards hesitate. The manager finally noticed the same thing. He followed the direction of the crowd gaze and saw Alexander clearly for the first time. And the moment their eyes met, the manager's expression changed completely. The manager stared at the tall man beside Lily for several long seconds, and during that brief silence the entire balance of the room seemed to change. A moment earlier he had been focused entirely on removing Emily Carter from the restaurant before the angry guest caused further trouble. Now his attention had shifted completely. Something about the man standing beside the child made the manager feel a sudden chill of recognition that crept slowly up his spine. He had seen that face before, not in person, but in quiet conversations between wealthy clients and in photographs that circulated only among certain powerful circles in the city. Alexander Draven. The realization struck him like a sudden drop in temperature. The manager had heard the stories. Everyone in the highest levels of New York society had heard them. A businessman whose influence stretched far beyond finance. A man who owned companies, properties, and entire networks of power that few people fully understood. Yet the rumors always carried another layer of quiet warning. Alexander Draven was not someone to offend. The manager swallowed nervously and straightened his jacket as he stepped toward him. His earlier anger toward Emily had vanished completely, replaced by careful respect. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for the disturbance tonight," he said with forced calm. "We will resolve this situation immediately." Alexander Draven did not answer right away. His attention remained on Emily Carter for a moment longer. She was still standing with her folded apron in her hands while the two security guards waited nearby, uncertain whether they should continue escorting her toward the exit. Emily felt every pair of eyes in the restaurant on her. She was already preparing to walk out quietly when Alexander finally spoke. His voice was calm and controlled, yet it carried through the room with effortless authority. "The waitress stays." The words were simple, but they stopped the entire scene like a command that could not be questioned. The manager blinked in confusion, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Sir, she struck a guest," he began carefully. "Our policy requires immediate removal in situations like this." Alexander turned his head slowly toward him. His eyes held the quiet intensity of someone who had lived far longer than anyone in the room could imagine. "The guest insulted a child," Alexander replied, "and the waitress defended her." There was no anger in his voice, only a calm certainty that felt far more powerful than shouting. Around the room, several diners exchanged nervous glances. Even the arrogant man who had demanded Emily be fired hesitated as he listened. He still did not know who Alexander truly was, but the shift in the room had become impossible to ignore. The security guards stepped back instinctively as if they had received an invisible signal. The manager opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out. He understood now that this moment had moved beyond ordinary restaurant rules. Emily stood frozen where she was. She had expected to be escorted outside within seconds. Instead, the man she had never met before had just stopped the entire process with a single sentence. Lily looked up at her father with quiet admiration. The small girl understood something that most of the people in the room did not yet realize. When Alexander Draven decided something, the world around him tended to follow. The arrogant guest finally slammed his hand against the table and shouted that he would not tolerate being ignored in his own complaint. He pointed at Emily again and demanded that the manager continue with the removal immediately. But the manager did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Alexander. And for the first time since the argument began, the arrogant man noticed that no one in the room was responding to his authority anymore. The arrogant guest stared around the dining hall in disbelief as he realized that the room was no longer responding to him. Only minutes earlier, he had been the loudest voice in the restaurant. Now the attention of every single person had shifted toward the silent man standing beside the small girl with the silver brace. The guest let out a harsh laugh, trying to force confidence back into the situation. He said that this entire display was ridiculous and demanded that someone explain who exactly this stranger thought he was. His voice echoed loudly through the quiet hall, but it carried far less power than it had before. The manager of Nocturn Hall hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between the furious guest and the man whose presence had already begun to dominate the entire room. The manager looked toward Alexander Draven again, and this time his posture changed completely. The earlier tension in his shoulders disappeared as he lowered his head slightly in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but came very close. "Sir," he said carefully, "we were not aware that you were present this evening." The words hung in the air for a moment. Several guests nearby inhaled sharply as they heard the tone of deep respect in the manager's voice. The arrogant guest frowned, confused by the sudden shift in behavior. He turned toward Alexander with irritation and demanded to know why the manager was suddenly acting as if the man deserved special treatment. Alexander Draven remained calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not move closer. Yet the quiet authority surrounding him seemed to expand through the room like a shadow stretching beneath candlelight. The manager finally spoke the name that many in the restaurant had already begun to suspect. Mr. Alexander Draven is the owner of several establishments within this district, including the property that this restaurant stands on. The words landed like a heavy stone in still water. The arrogant guest blinked several times as the meaning slowly reached him. Around the dining hall, a ripple of whispers moved between tables. The pale woman near the window lowered her gaze immediately. The sharply dressed man at another table stood up and stepped away from the confrontation entirely. They knew far more than the manager had revealed aloud. Emily Carter stood frozen beside Lily, trying to process the revelation. She had never heard the name before, yet the reaction of everyone around her made it clear that this man was far more than just a wealthy property owner. Lily looked up at her father with quiet pride. The small girl already knew what the rest of the room was only beginning to understand. Her father's presence alone could silence an entire hall of powerful people. The arrogant guest finally found his voice again, though the confidence in it had weakened. He said that owning property did not excuse assault, and that he still expected the waitress to be removed. His words sounded less certain now. Alexander turned his gaze toward him slowly. For a brief moment, the lights of the chandeliers reflected in his eyes in a way that made them appear darker and deeper than before. The temperature in the room seemed to drop again, as if an unseen winter wind had entered through the doors. Alexander spoke calmly. The waitress acted with more honor than any person who laughed at a child tonight. His voice carried through the hall with quiet finality. Then he added one sentence that made several of the watchers stiffen immediately. "And the child you insulted is my daughter." The dining hall fell into a silence deeper than anything that had come before. Because the people who understood the hidden world knew that this moment had just changed everything. The silence that followed Alexander Draven's words seemed to freeze the entire dining hall in place. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the soft sounds of the city beyond the tall glass windows felt distant and unreal. The arrogant guest stood completely still. His earlier anger now tangled with confusion and something far closer to fear. He looked from Alexander to the small girl beside him, then back again as if trying to understand how the evening had shifted so dramatically in only a few minutes. Emily Carter felt the same shock spreading through her mind. She glanced down at Lily, remembering the quiet child who had simply wanted a dessert menu. Then she looked at Alexander Draven again. The man who had stepped forward to stop the entire restaurant from throwing her out was not only powerful. He was Lily's father. The truth settled over the room slowly but completely. Lily Draven was not just any child who had wandered into a wealthy restaurant. She was the daughter of the man whose presence alone had already silenced every voice in the hall. The arrogant guest cleared his throat and tried to recover the confidence that had carried him earlier in the evening. His voice sounded weaker now, though he tried to hide it behind forced arrogance. He said that even if the child was his daughter, it did not excuse violence. He pointed again toward Emily and insisted that she should still be removed for striking him. The words echoed through the quiet space, but they sounded hollow now. Several diners shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The manager looked as if he wished he could disappear entirely. Alexander Draven watched the man for a moment before speaking again. His voice remained calm and measured, but there was a quiet strength behind every word. The waitress defended a child who was being mocked by grown adults, he said. She acted with courage while the rest of this room chose silence. His gaze moved briefly across the diners who had laughed earlier. A few of them lowered their heads immediately. Alexander then turned his attention back to Emily. For the first time since the confrontation began, he truly studied her. She still stood with her folded apron in her hands, clearly prepared to accept the consequences of what she had done. She did not try to hide. She did not apologize for defending Lily. She simply waited. Alexander Draven had lived for centuries and had seen countless examples of human behavior: greed, cruelty, fear, ambition. But courage was rarer than most people realized, and sometimes it appeared in the most unexpected places. He looked at Emily and asked a simple question. Why did you defend her when everyone else was laughing? Emily hesitated only for a moment. She glanced down at Lily and then back at Alexander. Her answer came quietly but clearly, because she looked like she needed someone to stand beside her. The simplicity of the answer spread through the room like a ripple. Lily's face brightened slightly as she heard it. The small girl reached out and gently held Emily's hand. The gesture was soft but sincere. For the first time that evening, Lily's smile returned, small but genuine. Alexander watched the moment carefully. Something inside his ancient expression softened in a way that very few people had ever seen. Around the dining hall, several guests sensed that the evening had moved beyond an ordinary argument. They were witnessing a decision being formed by a man whose choices rarely happened without consequence. And the person standing quietly beside his daughter had just changed the direction of that decision. For a long, quiet moment, no one inside Nocturn Hall spoke. The tension that had filled the restaurant earlier had changed into something far deeper and calmer, like the still surface of a lake after a storm. Emily Carter stood beside Lily with the small girl hand resting gently in hers. She had completely forgotten about the folded apron she was still holding. Her attention was on the child who had just smiled at her for the first time that evening. The warmth of that simple gesture spread through Emily's chest in a way that surprised her. She had defended Lily because it felt right. Nothing more complicated than that. Yet the entire night had turned into something far bigger than she ever expected. Across from them, Alexander Draven watched the scene quietly. His expression remained composed, yet the sharp intensity in his eyes had softened. Lily still held Emily's hand as if she did not want the moment to disappear. The small girl looked up at her father and then back at the waitress who had defended her when no one else would. Lily's voice was gentle as she spoke. She said that Emily had been kind when everyone else was laughing. The child's simple words carried more weight than anyone in the room expected. Alexander nodded slightly as he listened to his daughter. For centuries he had ruled a hidden world, where loyalty and strength determined survival. Yet kindness was something far rarer. Watching his daughter smile beside the young waitress stirred a quiet realization inside him. Emily Carter had not defended Lily because she knew who Lily's father was. She had done it because she believed it was right. The difference mattered more than most people would ever understand. The arrogant guest who had started the entire conflict shifted nervously near his table. His earlier anger had slowly faded as the room turned against him. Now he looked uncertain and uncomfortable as he realized how completely the situation had slipped beyond his control. Several diners who had laughed earlier avoided meeting Alexander's gaze. The manager stood nearby with his hands clasped together, unsure what the final outcome of the evening would be. Yet for the moment no one interrupted the quiet exchange between Alexander, Lily, and Emily. Alexander finally stepped a little closer. His voice when he spoke again was calm and steady, but this time there was something warmer behind it. He told Emily that courage was often tested in moments when the crowd chose silence. Tonight she had chosen differently. Emily looked down briefly, unsure how to respond to praise from a man whose presence clearly commanded the respect of everyone around him. She said quietly that she had simply done what she hoped someone would do for her if she were in Lily's place. Lily squeezed her hand again, as if confirming that the answer meant something important. Alexander Draven studied Emily for another long moment. Then he did something that caused several people in the dining hall to glance at each other in surprise. He extended his hand toward her in a simple, respectful gesture. Emily hesitated before accepting the handshake. His grip was firm but controlled. The small action felt strangely significant in the middle of such a tense evening. Alexander then turned his attention briefly toward the manager. His voice returned to its calm authority as he said that the restaurant would continue serving dinner and that the disturbance was over. The manager nodded quickly, relieved that the confrontation had ended without further chaos. Slowly the quiet tension around the room began to ease. Conversations returned in low, careful voices. The musicians near the staircase lifted their instruments again and resumed playing a soft melody. Yet the most important moment of the evening had already happened. Emily Carter stood beside Lily Draven no longer as a waitress waiting to be escorted out, but as the one person in the room who had chosen kindness when everyone else had chosen comfort. The soft music inside Nocturne Hall slowly filled the room again as the tension of the evening began to fade, but the atmosphere was not the same as it had been before. Conversations returned quietly, yet many of the diners still glanced toward the table where Alexander Draven stood beside his daughter and the waitress who had defended her. Moments like the one they had just witnessed did not happen often, and everyone understood that the night would be remembered long after the last plate had been cleared away. Emily Carter finally released the handshake and looked down at Lily again. The little girl was still holding her hand, and this time her smile looked brighter and more confident. The earlier sadness that had clouded her expression had disappeared completely. Lily said softly that she still wanted the strawberry cake Emily had mentioned earlier. The simple request caused Emily to laugh gently, the sound light and warm after such a serious confrontation. She told Lily that she would personally make sure it was the best dessert served in the restaurant that night. The manager quickly stepped forward and assured them that the kitchen would prepare it immediately. His tone had changed completely from earlier in the evening. Instead of authority, there was now careful respect in every word. The arrogant guest who had started the entire conflict no longer looked powerful or confident. He stood awkwardly beside his chair, aware that the attention of the room had shifted entirely away from him. Several diners who had laughed with him earlier avoided eye contact and quietly returned to their meals. Eventually, he muttered a brief complaint and gathered his jacket before leaving the restaurant without another word. His departure passed almost unnoticed. The center of the evening had moved elsewhere. A few minutes later, a beautifully plated slice of strawberry cake arrived at Lily's table. Emily carefully placed it in front of her, and the small girl eyes lit up with excitement. Lily thanked her and took the first bite with obvious happiness. Alexander Draven watched the moment silently. For centuries he had seen the world through the lens of power, strategy, and survival. Yet, the sight of his daughter laughing softly over a simple dessert reminded him of something far more important than any empire he had built. Kindness. The kind that appeared without warning and without expectation of reward. After Lily finished her cake, Alexander turned back to Emily. His voice was calm but sincere as he spoke. He told her that courage and kindness were rare qualities, especially in moments when standing up meant risking everything. Then he made an offer that surprised not only Emily, but nearly everyone who overheard it. He said that if she ever wished to leave the exhausting cycle of late-night shifts and uncertain tips, there would always be a place for someone with her character within his companies. Emily stood speechless for a moment. She had never imagined that defending a stranger would lead to an opportunity like this. But more important than the offer itself was the realization that doing the right thing had changed the course of her life in ways she could never have predicted. Lily squeezed her hand again and told her that she hoped Emily would visit them again soon. Emily smiled and promised that she would. As Alexander and Lily prepared to leave the restaurant, the room grew respectfully quiet once more. Not because anyone was afraid, but because they had witnessed something rare. A moment when courage had answered cruelty and kindness had been rewarded instead of punished. And as Emily watched the father and daughter walk toward the door, she realized that sometimes the smallest act of standing beside someone who needed help could change far more than a single evening inside a crowded restaurant.